The kingdom slept beneath a wide silver moon, its rivers glinting like streams of glass and its fields lying still as if they too had bowed their heads to the night. Crickets sang their thin music in the grass, and somewhere an owl lifted its wings into the darkness. It was a quiet night, but not without whispers, for in hushed corners and low firesides, the villagers spoke of a tale they could not forget. They called it the story of the necklace of thorns, a cruel chain woven not of gold or silver, but of sharp barbs meant to wound. They said once there was a girl young and fair who was made to wear it. The necklace was no ornament, no gift of love or honor. It was punishment, devised in envy and bitterness, a way to press pain into her very skin. The thorns dug deep until beads of blood slipped down her neck, staining her dress, marking her as less than human. Some villagers remembered seeing her pass through the square, her head bowed, her steps light but trembling, the cruel circle biting into her flesh. Some had turned away in shame, some in fear, and others, those with hearts like stone, had laughed at her suffering. But that was not all. For what began as cruelty ended as something else entirely, something that the people still murmured about in awe. They said that on the night when the moon was at its fullest, when shadows stretched longest across the earth, the impossible happened. The necklace stirred. The dry thorns, once sharp and cruel, softened. Buds swelled along the cruel branches, buds that had never been there before. And before the first cockcrow, roses had burst forth, crimson roses, full and rich, their petals glistening with dew as if washed by tears. Children listening to their elders at the hearth would lean forward wide-eyed. "But how can thorns bloom?" they asked. And the elders, their voices lowered, would say, "Because the necklace carried more than cruelty. It carried her pain, her patience, her prayers." The earth heard her suffering, the moon watched her tears, and together they answered. Some claimed they had seen the roses with their own eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, as if each petal carried a hidden flame. Others swore the fragrance filled the air for miles, sweet and heavy, waking the sleepers and drawing them from their huts into the night. To some it was a miracle, to others a warning. Yet no one, not even the cruelest tongue, could deny that something had happened that night which no man or woman could explain. And so the whispers lived on. The necklace of thorns became a story parents told their children when they wanted them to understand both the weight of cruelty and the strange power of endurance. It was a tale of pain that turned into beauty, of suffering that was not swallowed by silence but answered by the world itself. And though years had passed, though the girl herself was long gone, the moonlight still touched the land with silver fingers as if remembering her. "Be kind," the villagers would say softly when the story was told. "For the thorns you give may bloom against your will. And roses born of sorrow are stronger than any crown of gold." And in the hush of that quiet kingdom night, it was almost as if the air itself carried the faintest trace of roses, blooming where none should bloom, reminding all who listened that the story was not finished. It was still alive, carried forward like a secret in the moonlight. She was 20 years old, though her face still held the softness of youth, and her eyes carried a gentleness that made even the fiercest heart falter. In the village she was known not for wealth or fine clothes, but for the way her hands coaxed life from the smallest of things. Where others saw weeds in the field, she saw wildflowers waiting to bloom. She gathered them tenderly, weaving them into little garlands for children, or pressing their petals into bowls of water to soothe fevers. The old women whispered that she had her late mother's gift, a quiet grace that healed without speaking. Her mother had been the kind of woman who lit up the air simply by walking into it, but death had carried her away too soon, leaving the girl in the hands of a new mistress of the house. The stepmother, sharp-eyed and bitter, took no liking to the gentle child. Where the mother had praised her kindness, the stepmother sneered at it, calling it weakness. Where the mother had smiled at her patience, the stepmother mocked it, saying it was nothing but laziness disguised. Life under her stepmother's roof was a daily test of endurance. Her meals were scraps, her clothing little more than rags. While the stepsister adorned herself in beads and bright cloth, the girl's only ornaments were the stains of work upon her hands. From dawn until dusk she labored, fetching water, grinding grain, tending animals, yet she carried out her tasks without complaint. The villagers noticed. Some pitied her, offering a smile or a kind word when they could, though few dared cross her stepmother. Others turned their eyes away, too used to the sight of the meek being trampled by the proud. But it was in the meadows and fields that she found her solace. She would slip away when chores allowed, kneeling among the wildflowers as if they were her companions. She spoke to them softly, telling them secrets she dared not give to human ears, and in return, the flowers seemed to lean toward her, brightening as if they understood. The children, chasing her through the fields, sometimes called her the flower sister, for she always had a crown of daisies or a clutch of marigolds at hand. And when anyone was ill, it was she who gathered herbs with steady hands, brewing teas and poultices that worked as if by magic. The stepmother hated this most of all. To her, the girl's kindness was a mirror reflecting her own hardness. The way villagers spoke in low admiration of the girl's grace felt like a thorn in her pride. And so she tightened her grip, loading the girl with heavier burdens, mocking her for the dirt under her nails, reminding her daily that she was nothing more than a servant in her own home. Yet the girl did not wither. If anything, she grew stronger in silence, her spirit like the wildflowers she tended, trampled underfoot but always rising again when the rains returned. In her eyes lived a light that no cruelty had yet dimmed, though it flickered in moments when loneliness pressed too heavily upon her. At night, lying on her thin mat, she would dream of her mother, of the warmth of arms that had once shielded her, and sometimes tears would wet her pillow. But come dawn, she rose again with the sun, ready to meet the day with whatever strength she could gather. Those who watched her closely knew there was something different about her, something that could not be explained by beauty alone. It was in the way she carried herself, head bowed yet never broken, shoulders bent with work but never slumped in defeat. She moved like a flower in the wind, bending but never snapping, fragile in appearance but enduring in truth. And though she herself did not yet know it, this quiet grace was the very thing that would one day turn cruelty into wonder and pain into roses. The house where she lived was not a home, though once it had been. In her mother's time it had echoed with laughter, smelled of warm bread, and held the comfort of a place where love made even the poorest rooms shine. Now, under her stepmother's rule, it was filled with sharp words, bitter sighs, and the restless clatter of demands that never ceased. Her stepmother sat tall in her pride, her tongue as quick as a whip, and her daughter, plump, spoiled and cruel in imitation, followed her every gesture as if cruelty were a game to be mastered. Together they made the girl's life a theater of humiliation. If she rose early to fetch water, they complained she was too slow. If she carried baskets of grain, they mocked the dirt on her hands. If she tended flowers in the yard, they accused her of idling, and when the neighbors praised her patience, they laughed behind closed doors, calling her the mule who thinks herself a dove. Her clothes were a constant source of their ridicule. While the stepmother and stepsister wore dresses dyed in bold colors, scarlets, saffron, indigo, the girl was left with tattered cloth that hung loosely from her thin frame. The hems were frayed, the sleeves patched so many times that no two pieces of fabric matched. "Look at her," the stepsister would sneer, parading before the mirror. "She looks like a beggar child wandering in from the fields." And the stepmother would nod with satisfaction, as though the girl's humiliation were proof of her own superiority. Meals were no kinder. At the table, her stepmother and stepsister dined on steaming bread, roasted meats and bowls of rice glistening with oil, while the girl was left to scrape burnt crumbs from the pot or chew on stale crusts. If she reached for more, the stepmother's eyes would narrow, and the stepsister would slap her hand away with a smirk. Hunger often gnawed at her belly as she worked, but she endured it, telling herself that the wild berries she gathered in secret, or the herbs she nibbled in the fields, were enough to keep her standing. And still, despite it all, she nurtured beauty in the quiet corners of her world. In the yard behind the house, where no one cared to look, she planted stray seeds she had found on her walks. Slowly, little patches of life began to grow, a cluster of violets here, a spray of wild daisies there, and once even a young rose bush that had taken root beside a broken wall. When her chores were done and no one called her name, she would sit near them, touching their leaves with tender fingers, whispering her secrets to them. The flowers became her silent companions, her confidants, and perhaps her reflection, fragile, overlooked, yet persistent, growing against all odds and soil that should have rejected them. The children of the village often noticed her wandering with flowers in her hands. They would run up to her and beg for garlands, and she would tie blooms into circles and set them on their heads, laughing softly as their faces lit up. Once a child asked her why she never wore flowers herself. She smiled sadly and said, "Because they are too precious to be wasted on me. Better they make you happy." The child did not understand, but years later would recall that answer with sorrow. Inside the house, however, there was no laughter. Only the constant grind of work. Washing, scrubbing, pounding grain, carrying loads heavier than her thin shoulders deserved. Her hands became rough, her back ached, yet she never refused a task. And every time her stepmother mocked her for being plain or clumsy, she bit back her tears, choosing silence over protest. The cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it was a look of disdain, a plate pushed away without thanks, a chore handed to her with a sneer. Other times it was deliberate mockery, the stepsister twirling in new jewelry while the girl stood nearby, her neck bare and marked with the faint scars of old tasks. Who would ever notice her? They would say within earshot, laughter spilling like venom. She has nothing but weeds and dirt to offer. Yet in the quiet of her heart, the girl carried something they could not touch. It was not pride, she was too humble for that. It was not anger, her soul refused to rot with bitterness. It was simply a steadfast spirit, a seed of grace planted by her mother long ago, watered each day by her endurance. Like the wildflower she loved, she lived quietly, unnoticed by many, despised by some, but blooming nonetheless in her own way. The stepmother and stepsister believed they had reduced her to nothing, stripping her of beauty, dignity, and joy. What they did not see, what they could not understand, was that each act of cruelty was like a thorn pressed deeper into her life. And thorns, though cruel, have a secret: they can shelter roses. The stepmother's jealousy grew like a creeping vine, wrapping itself tighter with each passing day. She could not stand the way the villagers' eyes softened when the girl walked past, even in her rags. There was no fine silk on her back, no jewelry at her throat, and yet there was something in her bearing, a quiet grace, a patience, a gentleness, that drew people to her more surely than bright colors or polished stones ever could. The baker's wife often slipped her a small roll when she came by with the grain. The shepherds called her little sister, and trusted her to soothe their restless lambs. Even the old blind man at the crossroads smiled when her footsteps approached, saying, "The air grows lighter when you come." Each time the stepmother overheard such words, something sour twisted inside her. She had worked hard to present herself and her daughter as figures of importance, women to be admired and envied. She wore rings on her fingers, draped cloths of bold dye across her shoulders, and spent hours each morning arranging her daughter's hair with beads. Yet for all her efforts, it was the girl in rags whom people noticed, not with loud admiration but with quiet respect. And that was worse, for respect lingers longer than admiration. Her own daughter, spoiled and greedy, fumed as well. She could not bear how the boys of the village, though polite to her, often cast their eyes after her stepsister. "Why do they look at her?" she hissed one afternoon, stomping her foot so hard the beads in her hair rattled. "She's nothing but a servant. She doesn't even try to be beautiful." The stepmother soothed her with honeyed words, but her own heart burned with the same question. Why should a girl dressed in rags, with hands calloused from work, outshine her own daughter? Why should her patience be praised while her own cleverness was ignored? It was an insult and she would not endure it. And so her jealousy hardened into cruelty sharpened with purpose. She began setting traps of humiliation. When guests came, she forced the girl to serve them, making sure her tattered sleeves and bare feet were in plain sight. "See," she would say, laughing lightly, "she is only fit for labor." But often the guests looked at the girl with pity or admiration, and this only stoked the fire in her chest. She denied the girl rest, giving her double tasks when the stepsister complained of fatigue. If the girl faltered, the stepmother's tongue lashed her. If she endured, the stepmother grew more resentful. It seemed that no punishment could break her completely, and that resilience was a constant thorn in the woman's pride. At night, lying awake in her fine bed, the stepmother would imagine ways to diminish her further. She pictured the girl stumbling, her dignity stripped before all, her beauty marred, her spirit crushed. Yet morning after morning, when the girl emerged from her small corner of the house, pale but steady, there was still light in her eyes. That light infuriated the stepmother most of all. "She must be made to bow," she muttered one night to her daughter. "Her quiet ways have bewitched the people. We must find a way to show them she is not a flower but a weed." The stepsister, who envied every glance her stepsister received, nodded eagerly. "Let's make her look ridiculous. Let's make her hurt." The plan had not yet formed, but its seed had been planted. And like all dark seeds, watered by envy and nourished by malice, it would grow into something cruel. The girl herself, sensing the weight of their eyes upon her, carried on as best she could. She bent to her work, sang softly to herself in the meadows, and tried not to hear the sharp laughter that followed her steps. But even she began to feel the storm gathering around her. It was there in her stepmother's fixed smile, in her stepsister's narrowed eyes, in the whispers that trailed her like shadows. The house no longer felt like a cage, it felt like a trap waiting to spring. The day came when the stepmother's jealousy ripened into action. It was during the midsummer gathering when the whole village assembled in the square to give thanks for the season's growth and to share food, music, and stories beneath the high sun. Bright cloths fluttered from poles, children danced with ribbons in their hands, and the air was heavy with the scent of roasting meat and sweet bread. It was a day meant for joy, for kinship, for laughter echoing through the streets. Yet for one girl, it would be the day of deepest humiliation. From the moment dawn broke, the stepmother's voice rang sharp through the house. "You will come with us today," she declared, her eyes gleaming with a strange satisfaction. The girl looked up from her work, startled, for she was rarely invited to such gatherings. Usually she was left behind to scrub pots or tend animals while the others paraded themselves in fine attire. "But I have no dress," she said softly, glancing at her patched and faded garments. The stepmother's lips curled. "You will wear what I give you." And from a chest she drew forth not a gown, not a shawl, but something twisted and cruel, a necklace fashioned of thick dried thorn branches. Its points jutted in every direction, sharp enough to pierce skin with the lightest touch. "Put it on," the woman commanded. The girl hesitated, but the stepsister's laughter rang out, sharp and eager, and the stepmother's eyes burned with threat. With trembling fingers she lifted the garland of pain and settled it around her neck. Instantly the thorns bit into her skin. A thin line of blood traced down her collarbone, hidden poorly by the edge of her ragged dress. They walked together to the square, the stepmother and stepsister resplendent in their bright cloths and beads, the girl behind them, head lowered, her cruel necklace gleaming dully in the sunlight. At first no one noticed, but when the crowd gathered and the music slowed, murmurs began. "What is she wearing?" whispered one woman. "Thorns," said another, eyes wide. Children pointed, some giggling, others shrinking back in fear. The stepsister, delighted, twirled before them, saying loudly, "Isn't it fitting? She loves weeds and wildflowers, now she wears them." The stepmother only smiled as if she had arranged a grand jest for all to enjoy. And though some villagers frowned, pity flickering in their eyes, few dared speak against her. After all, the stepmother's tongue was sharp, her reach long, and many feared crossing her. So the whispers grew louder, the laughter spread, and the girl stood still in the middle of it all, her neck stinging, her cheeks flushed with shame. Yet she did not cry. Though every thorn pressed deeper with each breath, though her body trembled beneath the weight of so many eyes, she held her head upright. There was a dignity in her stillness, a quiet defiance that unsettled those who looked too closely. The stepmother noticed it, and for a moment her smile faltered. But then she hissed to her daughter, "Let them laugh. Let her bleed. Tonight no one will admire her again." As the festival wore on, the girl moved silently among the crowds, serving food, carrying water, enduring the taunts and smirks that followed her steps. With each movement the thorns dug deeper, and small drops of blood stained her collar, yet she bore it with a strange grace that only deepened the unease of those who pitied her. Some whispered to each other, "This is too cruel," but none dared confront the stepmother, who basked in her triumph. When the sun began to sink and the music softened, the girl finally slipped away from the noise, retreating to a quiet corner of the fields. There at last she let her shoulders sag. Pain throbbed at her throat and tears filled her eyes. She lifted her hands to the necklace, hoping to loosen it, but the branches had twisted too tightly. Every tug brought new stings of blood. So she sank to her knees in the grass, her tears falling onto the cruel garland. In that moment, beneath the rising moon, her voice broke free in a whisper. "Mother," she breathed, "if you can hear me, give me strength. Let not my pain be wasted." The night air seemed to stir at her words as though listening. The stars blinked more brightly above, and the moon cast a pale silver glow upon the cruel thorns circling her neck. The girl closed her eyes, her prayer hanging in the air, and though she did not yet know it, something in the world had begun to shift. For cruelty had found its peak, and the earth itself was preparing to answer. The festival ended in songs and laughter, but none of that warmth followed her home. The stepmother and stepsister stumbled into the hut in high spirits, their arms heavy with leftover bread and trinkets, their lips stained with wine. They spoke loudly of who had praised their finery, who had envied their beauty, never once glancing toward the girl who lingered in the shadows. When at last the house grew quiet and their snores filled the dark, she crept to her corner. The necklace was still tight around her throat, biting with every movement. She reached again to loosen it, but her fingers met resistance at every turn. The thorns had knotted into themselves, fastening so cruelly that they seemed alive. She tried pulling, twisting, even biting at one strand, but each attempt only drove the points deeper. Thin trails of blood ran down her chest, staining her plain dress with dark, sticky patches. At last she sank onto her mat, trembling. The hut was silent except for her ragged breath and the soft crackle of dying embers in the hearth. Shadows leaned long and heavy against the walls. She felt them pressing closer as though eager to smother her cries. But she did not scream. Instead, she pressed her palms together, bowing her head until her forehead nearly touched the earth floor. "Mother," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "I do not know if you see me still. But if you do, let me endure this night. Let my pain not turn to bitterness. Let me remain yours even in suffering." Her tears fell onto the thorns. They glistened faintly but only for a moment before sinking into the dry wood. She leaned back, her body shaking, and traced the ridges of the cruel necklace with trembling fingers. Each thorn seemed to mock her, each one a memory of the stepmother's hatred. "You are nothing," the thorns seemed to whisper. "You are weeds. You are unworthy of love." The words sank deep, but still she whispered against them. "No. I'm not weeds. I am my mother's daughter. I am still alive." Outside the wind stirred. It rattled the thatched roof, moaned through the cracks in the door. She imagined it carrying her words out into the night, far beyond the hut, to the trees and the fields, to the river, to the heavens themselves. Her body weakened, her head drooped, but she clung to the thread of prayer as if it were her only lifeline. Hours passed like that, pain, prayer, silence and tears. Her neck burned, her chest throbbed, her limbs grew heavy. Once she thought she heard laughter, sharp, cruel, echoing in the dark as if the necklace itself rejoiced in her suffering. She pressed her hands to her ears and whispered louder, "You will not break me." The room was so small, yet the night felt endless. She thought of the flowers she once tended in secret, tiny violets at the edge of the fields, wild roses that grew untended by human hands. They too had been fragile, bent by storms and trampled by careless feet. Yet somehow they bloomed again. The memory gave her strength. She lifted her chin slightly despite the thorns. "Perhaps," she murmured, "even thorns carry a secret the cruel do not see." Her eyes closed at last, exhaustion pulling her down. But though her body surrendered to the weight of pain, her spirit did not sleep. In her dreams she wandered a meadow she had never seen before, endless, filled with flowers swaying in silver light. In the center grew a single rosebush, its blossoms red as blood, its thorns sharp as spears. She reached for it, unafraid, and as her fingers brushed the thorns, they softened. The branches bent gently around her wrist, not cutting but caressing. A voice rose from the flowers, soft and strong. "Endure. At midnight all wounds will answer." She woke with a gasp. The hut was silent. A pale shaft of moonlight fell through a gap in the roof, touching her face. The thorns still cut into her, and yet something in her chest had changed. The pain was not gone, but it was no longer hollow. It was full, alive, as if each drop of blood carried a seed of promise. She pressed her palms together one last time, whispering, "Let it be as you will, O night. Let my suffering become something more than sorrow." And as the moon climbed higher, nearing its zenith, the necklace stirred faintly against her skin, though she did not yet notice. The hut was drenched in silence, broken only by the soft breath of the sleeping stepmother and her daughter in the next room. The girl lay awake on her mat, body heavy, neck throbbing with the cruel crown of thorns biting deeper with every movement. She had nearly given herself to despair when the moon reached its height in the sky, spilling its silver light through the narrow cracks in the roof. The beam found her where she lay, as though the heavens themselves sought her out. At first she thought it was another dream, the way the thorns shifted. A faint tremor ran through them, so subtle she wondered if it was the quickened beat of her heart. But then she felt it clearly, a loosening not of cruelty but of change. She lifted trembling fingers to her throat, expecting the sharp sting of barbs, but instead her fingertips brushed against something tender, soft as velvet. She gasped. Between the bloodied spikes, small buds had begun to swell. They pushed through the wood like new life through cracked earth, pale and fragile, yet undeniable. The thorns no longer only pierced her flesh, they had become stems, and from those stems roses were preparing to bloom. The air in the hut shifted. It grew sweeter, touched with a fragrance no one had smelled in that dark place for many years, the scent of roses at night, cool and faintly spicy, carrying memory and promise. She sat up despite her pain, tears streaking down her cheeks as one by one the buds opened. Crimson petals unfurled under the moonlight, glowing faintly as though each one held a hidden flame. She pressed a hand to her chest, awe overtaking her agony. The necklace that had been a weapon now became a garland of roses, each blossom vivid against the pallor of her skin. Where the thorns had cut, petals now blossomed, drinking her blood as though it were the water of life itself. Outside the wind paused. Even the insects seemed to still. The night listened. She whispered, voice trembling, "Mother, is this your answer?" The roses swayed gently though no breeze stirred them. Their glow illuminated the small hut, washing away the shadows. Her rags shone like silk under that light. The girl touched one blossom, marveling at its warmth. It was as though her suffering had been transfigured, her blood woven into beauty that could not be denied. The fragrance drifted beyond the walls, curling into the village streets. Stray dogs lifted their heads, ears twitching. An old woman stirred in her sleep, murmuring a forgotten prayer. Children shifted in their dreams, smiling though they did not know why. The roses were not for her alone, they were announcing themselves to the world. She rose shakily to her feet, no longer bowed by pain but lifted by wonder. The roses pulsed faintly as though alive with breath, their petals shimmering in the moonlight. Each one seemed to sing without words, of endurance, of sorrow turned to beauty, of wounds that did not end in death but in life. Tears streamed freely now, but they were not only of grief. She felt her heart open like those roses, her suffering no longer a burden but a flowering. "If this is the way," she whispered, "then let my pain be my gift. Let it show that cruelty cannot bury what is meant to bloom." At that very moment, the largest rose at the center of the necklace opened fully. Its petals glowed so brightly that the entire hut shone like a lantern, casting red light onto the ground outside. The stepmother and stepsister stirred in their beds, frowning but did not wake. They muttered and rolled over, blind to the miracle within their own house. The girl, however, felt herself reborn. The weight of the thorns had become the weight of blossoms, heavy but fragrant, pulling her toward life instead of despair. Her neck no longer burned. Instead, it pulsed with warmth as if every wound had been kissed into healing. She sank to her knees, overwhelmed. The earth beneath her caught her tears and seemed to tremble with them. The roses swayed again as though in answer, and their light grew brighter. For a moment she thought she saw shadows moving in the glow, her mother's smile, faint but sure, watching from the petals. The night stretched long, yet she felt no fear, no hunger, no loneliness. She wore her crown of pain turned into glory, and the moon bore witness. Beyond the hut, the village remained asleep, ignorant of the miracle unfolding in their midst. But the river heard, and the trees and the stars. When the clock of the night struck its hidden hour, midnight, the roses were in full bloom. The fragrance spread far beyond the village, carried on unseen winds. It drifted across fields and over rooftops toward the palace on the hill. And though none yet knew its meaning, the land itself seemed to sigh in relief, as though a long-forgotten song had been sung once more. The girl touched the largest rose at her throat and whispered with trembling certainty, "I am not broken. I am alive." And the roses glowed brighter still, as though to crown her truth. The first light of dawn touched the horizon, painting the edges of the sky with gold. The girl, weary but upright, stepped out of her hut. Her rags still clung to her body, but the roses at her throat glowed with a quiet brilliance that no garment could dim. Their fragrance floated on the morning air, mingling with the mist that rolled over the fields. At first, only a few villagers stirring early for chores noticed her. A man carrying a basket of grain halted mid-step. His wife, walking beside him, covered her mouth with her hand. Word spread quickly as whispers tend to in small places. Soon men and women gathered along the path, their morning tasks forgotten, eyes wide with disbelief. There she was, the girl they had pitied, mocked, or ignored, walking slowly through the heart of the village, every step steady despite the thorns that had once pierced her flesh. Now those same thorns bore roses, rich crimson, their petals trembling with dew and light. The villagers stared, hushed, as though they stood before something holy. No one spoke at first. The silence was heavy, charged. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Is she a spirit?" The mother shook her head, her lips quivering, unable to answer. An old man leaned on his staff and murmured, "No spirit bleeds as she does. This is flesh-made miracle." The girl's gaze moved over them, calm and unwavering. She did not raise her voice, nor did she reproach. She simply walked, her eyes clear despite the weariness that shadowed her face. The roses spoke for her, their fragrance carrying what words could not: pain transfigured, cruelty undone, beauty born of blood. The stepmother and stepsister, roused at last by the crowd's murmurs, pushed through the gathering. Their eyes widened as they saw her. Fear flickered across their faces, quickly hidden beneath scorn. But the villagers were watching too closely now. They saw the twitch of guilt, the tremor in the stepmother's hands. They remembered the cruel commands, the whispered lies, the girl's silence in the face of endless cruelty. And they understood. "She wore that necklace last night," someone whispered. "I saw it. She bled. another said softly, shame coloring their tone. We did nothing. The murmur spread and the crowd shifted uneasily. Those who had turned away from her suffering now bowed their heads. They had watched, knowing yet silent. But the roses allowed no denial. They testified louder than any voice could. This girl had suffered, and yet she stood radiant. The girl paused at the village square, where the market stall stood empty in the pale light. She lifted her chin, and the roses caught the sun's first rays, blazing brighter. For a moment, it seemed as though she wore not thorns but a crown. Her lips parted, but no reproach came, only a breath, soft as prayer. The villagers sank to their knees. Not because she commanded it, but because something within them demanded it. They could not stand in the presence of such wonder without bowing to it. Even the children fell silent, their eyes wide, their little hands pressed together. Only the stepmother remained standing, her face twisted with defiance, but her body trembled, betraying her. She could not deny what stood before her. The necklace meant to break had bloomed, and in that blooming, her cruelty was revealed for all to see. The girl did not look at her. She did not need to. The roses spoke the truth without her saying a word. When the sun rose fully, washing the village in gold, the fragrance of the roses lingered everywhere. It sank into the earth, into the wooden beams of houses, into the very air. The villagers knew even then that they would never forget this morning. The girl turned her steps toward the fields beyond the village, her pace steady, her shoulders unbowed. She did not look back, but the villagers followed with their eyes, some weeping silently, others whispering prayers. For the first time, they saw her not as a burden, not as a shadow, but as a living wonder who had endured and transformed cruelty into beauty. And as the last of the morning mist rose, the villagers felt the weight of their silence more heavily than ever before. The village remained heavy with awe, but inside the stepmother's heart, awe curdled into fury. As others whispered of miracles and bowed their heads in reverence, she clenched her fists until her nails bit into her palms. How dare this girl, this orphan, this burden, draw the eyes of the whole village? How dare she shine when all her life she had been meant for silence? That night, when the girl returned to the hut, the stepmother followed her inside, her steps sharp and uneven. The glow of the roses still lit the dim room, casting a soft radiance over the walls. The stepmother's lips twisted as she stared at the blossoms, red as blood and fragrant as summer fields. You think this makes you special? She hissed. You think roses will make them love you? You are nothing but thorns, and I will strip you bare. She lunged forward, seizing the necklace. But the moment her fingers touched the roses, they cut deep. The petals hardened into blades, slicing her skin. She cried out and jerked back, crimson spilling across her hands. In her rage, she struck again, clawing at the blossoms, but each time the thorns bit deeper, rejecting her touch. The girl stood silent, trembling, but not from fear. She lifted her hands in quiet prayer, her eyes closing as though she heard a voice beyond the room. The roses glowed brighter, responding not to cruelty but to her calm endurance. The stepmother staggered back, her hands torn and bleeding. She cursed, shaking with pain and fury. The stepsister appeared in the doorway, eyes wide with terror, but the stepmother shoved her aside, snarling. It is sorcery. A curse. I will not be shamed by her trickery. But her words sounded hollow. The villagers who had gathered near the hut, drawn by the cries, now stood in the doorway watching. They saw the stepmother's bloodied hands, the girl's calm posture, the roses blooming ever brighter. The contrast spoke louder than accusations. The stepmother realized too late that her own fury betrayed her. Where the girl had endured suffering and bloomed, she, the mistress of the house, had turned cruelty into madness. The villagers' eyes hardened. Whispers rose. The necklace punishes the cruel. The roses guard her. The stepmother fled into the night, her cries echoing like those of a wounded beast. But in her heart, envy only deepened. She vowed that if the roses had made the girl beloved, she would find a way to crush both the blossoms and the one who wore them. The fragrance of roses did not stop at the edge of the village. It drifted over hills and through forests, carried by breezes that seemed intent on spreading the miracle. Travelers along the road paused, bewildered, their senses filled with sweetness in a season when no roses bloomed. They carried the tale onward, of a girl with a necklace of living flowers, a girl who turned suffering into beauty. Within days, the rumor reached the ears of the palace guards, then the courtiers, and at last the king himself. At first, he dismissed it as peasant superstition. But when even his advisers, sober men who had long scorned tales of wonder, admitted the fragrance had reached the palace gates, he frowned. Send a messenger, the king commanded. I would know the truth of this. The envoy he chose was a loyal captain, a man unshaken by fear or fancy. He rode swiftly, reaching the village at dawn. As he dismounted, the villagers guided him wordlessly to the square. There the girl stood among them, the roses still fresh, glowing faintly though the sun was already high. The captain froze, his mouth parting despite himself. He had expected some trick, a garland stitched in secret, a peasant's ruse. But no seam held those blossoms together. They grew from thorns twined around her throat, alive, swaying gently as though in silent song. Their fragrance filled the square, wrapping the air with sweetness that eased even the hardest heart. He bowed low. By order of the king, I have come to see the wonder of which all speak. And now I see it with my own eyes. The villagers watched, hushed, as the envoy studied her, not as one studies a prisoner or a curiosity, but with reverence. He saw the marks of old wounds beneath the roses, scars that had been transfigured by blossoms. He saw the quiet strength in her gaze, the humility with which she bore the miracle. "Come with me," he said gently, lowering his voice as though in the presence of sacred ground. "The king himself commands your presence. He wishes to meet the one whom roses have chosen." The girl hesitated, her hands trembling. To leave the village, the fields, the memories of her mother, was she ready? But the roses swayed, releasing a fragrance like reassurance. She nodded. The villagers wept softly, some reaching out to touch the hem of her garment as though to carry a blessing. Even the children whispered prayers as she passed. The captain led her to his horse, bowing again before helping her mount. As they rode toward the palace, the roses glowed brighter in the morning sun, their fragrance trailing behind like a herald. The villagers watched until she disappeared over the hill, certain they had seen the birth of something that would change not just their lives, but the kingdom itself. The palace was a place of marble columns and echoing halls, yet when the girl entered, it seemed as if all its splendor dimmed before her. She walked quietly, her steps measured, her gaze lowered, but the roses at her throat blazed with color. Their fragrance spilled into the chamber long before she reached the throne, causing courtiers to glance at one another, whispering in awe. Some clutched their chests, others bowed their heads, and even the proudest nobles felt something soften within them. The king, seated upon his carved throne, straightened as she approached. He had heard tales of miracles, but seldom had they lived beyond rumor. Now, as the fragrance reached him, as he saw the roses blooming red and full against the girl's plain dress, he leaned forward. There was no artifice here. No trick. This was suffering transfigured into beauty. The herald announced her name, but she scarcely seemed to hear. She stood before the throne, trembling yet composed, the glow of the blossoms crowning her with dignity. The king studied her, not as one might examine a curiosity, but with the gravity of a man confronted with truth. "Child," he said, his voice softened by wonder, "tell me what has brought you here." The court fell silent. Even the rustle of silk robes ceased. The girl lifted her eyes, and for the first time, her voice carried not only to her tormentors or neighbors, but to the very heart of the kingdom. She did not embellish, nor did she accuse with rage. She spoke simply, clearly of her life, of her mother's absence, of the stepmother's cruelty, of nights spent in hunger and humiliation. She told of the necklace forced upon her with malice, and of the night of pain when every thorn had pierced her flesh. As she spoke, the fragrance of the roses deepened, filling every corner of the hall. The courtiers shifted uneasily, their faces betraying shame, as if her words had peeled away the veils from their own hidden cruelties. But the girl's voice never wavered. She did not plead for pity, she bore witness. Her suffering was not her downfall, but her crown. The king, listening, felt as though the very earth spoke through her, an unyielding truth that could not be silenced. When she finished, silence stretched across the hall. No one dared speak for fear of breaking the spell. The king rose slowly from his throne, his eyes shining with something between sorrow and reverence. "You have suffered greatly," he said at last, "yet you stand before us not broken but in bloom. These roses are no trick of men, they are a sign, a testimony written in petals and blood. You have turned cruelty into beauty, endurance into strength." The courtiers bowed, some trembling, some weeping. The king raised his hand for quiet and declared, "But beauty must not only inspire, it must also bring justice. For if such cruelty is left unpunished, the fragrance of these roses will sour in the memory of our people. The wrong done to you must be made right." The girl bowed her head. She asked for no vengeance, no retribution, but the roses stirred, releasing a stronger fragrance as if they themselves agreed. The king turned to his guards, his voice ringing with authority. Bring the stepmother and her daughter. Let them stand before this court, before these roses, and let truth reveal itself." The courtiers murmured, sensing the weight of what was to come. The girl stood still, her face serene, but within her, her heart trembled. For the first time it seemed the thorns had not only bloomed for her, they would bloom against those who had sown cruelty. The summons was swift. The stepmother and stepsister, dragged from their hut in shame, were brought to the palace gates. They struggled, cried, and protested, but the guards were unmoved. When at last they entered the great hall, the fragrance of roses overwhelmed them. Their eyes darted to the girl, radiant with blossoms, and fear flared in their faces. The courtiers gasped at the contrast. The stepmother's hands were still bandaged from the cuts she had suffered when she tried to tear away the necklace. Her eyes burned with hatred, but her body trembled. The stepsister, pale and weak, clung to her side, unable to meet the girl's gaze. The king's voice thundered across the hall. "You forced upon her thorns meant to destroy. You sought to break her spirit, yet the very thorns you gave have betrayed you. Speak now, do you deny your cruelty?" The stepmother faltered, words catching in her throat. She tried to spin lies, to claim that the girl had bewitched them, that the roses were sorcery. But each time she spoke, the roses glowed brighter, their fragrance flooding the hall until her words withered on her tongue. The courtiers shook their heads, unmoved by her excuses. At last the stepsister fell to her knees, weeping. "It is true," she cried. "We mocked her, starved her, gave her rags while we feasted. The necklace was meant to shame her, to wound her. But we did not know." "You did know," the king cut in sharply. "You knew cruelty. You knew envy. And you chose silence when compassion was within your grasp." The girl watched quietly, her face calm but not vengeful. She did not gloat, did not speak. The roses swayed, their fragrance carrying the weight of her endurance. The king's judgment fell swift and heavy. "For your malice you are stripped of honor. You shall no longer walk in pride among the people. Your wealth is forfeit, your place in this village lost. You will labor in the fields beneath the sun, until you understand the worth of the one you despised." The stepmother cried out in rage, the stepsister in sorrow, but the guards dragged them away. The courtiers bowed their heads, chastened by the sight. The king turned once more to the girl, his tone softening. "And you, your suffering is not forgotten. The roses you bear are a sign not only of your endurance, but of the justice that now blooms in this hall." And in that moment, the fragrance deepened, as though the roses themselves had spoken their agreement. The days that followed the judgment felt unlike any the village had ever known. For years, whispers of cruelty and silent suffering had haunted the streets, but now a new fragrance lingered in the air. It was the fragrance of roses, rich and warm, a reminder that even wounds could give birth to wonder. The king decreed that the girl would not return to rags or obscurity. She was to be honored as a living symbol of endurance, as one who had turned pain into beauty. Though she bowed humbly before him, asking for nothing, the king's command was clear. Her story belonged not only to her, but to all who suffered in silence. The villagers, still shaken by the sight of the roses blooming in the palace, began to gather around her in reverence. Some brought baskets of petals. Others wove garlands to crown her hair. And slowly a new tradition was born. One night, under the same midnight sky that had first witnessed the miracle, the people came together. Children carried torches, elders carried drums, and women wove chains of roses that they draped around their necks. The fragrance drifted through the streets, carried by the cool night wind. The villagers sang, not songs of sorrow but songs of renewal. At the heart of the gathering stood the girl, her necklace still blooming, its petals luminous in the moonlight. She did not stand as a queen or a ruler, but as one of them, a daughter of the soil, a sister of the village, a survivor whose grace had blossomed into strength. The stepmother and stepsister, though stripped of honor, stood at the edges of the crowd. They wore no roses, only plain garments, and though shame bowed their heads, they too listened to the songs. For even in their disgrace, the roses spoke to them. Beauty was born from the very pain they had inflicted. The festival grew as the hours passed. The drums beat like a heartbeat, the songs rose like prayers, and at midnight the villagers performed the ritual they had promised to keep. Each person placed a garland of roses around their own neck, as the girl once had borne thorns. But now the garlands bloomed freely, without blood, without cruelty. "Let this be our remembrance," declared the eldest villager, lifting a torch high. "We will not forget the night when cruelty was turned to bloom. We will not forget the girl whose endurance made roses of her pain." The people responded with cheers, their voices echoing into the hills. The girl closed her eyes and for the first time her heart felt light. She had been made to carry shame, but now she carried something far greater, the love of her people and a festival that would live beyond her years. And so it was decreed. Each year, under the midnight moon, the villagers would gather, wear garlands of roses and sing of beauty born from suffering. The girl's story would never fade, for every rose worn in remembrance carried her name, her courage and her quiet grace. Generations passed, yet the story of the girl with the necklace of thorns was never forgotten. Elders told it beside firelight, children whispered it in play, lovers wove it into their vows. The roses that bloomed at midnight became more than flowers, they became living memory. It was said that if a garland of roses was placed in the moonlight, the petals would glow faintly, as though recalling the night when pain turned to beauty. Travelers who came upon the village marveled at this festival of midnight bloom, and the tale spread beyond the borders of the kingdom, carried by merchants, singers and poets. In time, no one remembered the stepmother's name, nor the bitterness of the stepsister. What endured was the girl's quiet grace and the miracle of roses. Mothers taught their daughters, if cruelty cuts deep, endure, for one day your wounds may flower. Fathers told their sons, never sow thorns in another's path, for roses will reveal the truth of your deeds. And so the roses became more than symbols of beauty. They were symbols of resilience, of justice, of a promise that no cruelty could endure forever. Fields of them grew along the edges of the village, red and fragrant, as though the earth itself remembered. On nights of hardship, when storms broke roofs or famine loomed, the villagers still gathered at midnight. They wore their garlands and sang their songs, and the fragrance of roses lifted their spirits. For they believed the girl's spirit lingered among them, her grace woven into every bloom. Children asked, did she ever grow old? Did she leave us? And the elders would smile, shaking their heads. She lives wherever a rose blooms at midnight. She lives wherever pain is turned into beauty. Thus the story became not only legend, but truth etched into the land itself. And though centuries turned and kingdoms rose and fell, the roses kept blooming under the moonlight, carrying the girl's memory in their petals. The people named them the eternal bloom. And so long as roses flowered at midnight, cruelty could never have the final word.